Welcome to the Minkcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices that the establishment would rather you didn't hear about. I'm senior staff writer Alan McLeod, and I'll be your host today. To help us continue with these interviews, we invite you to become a member of our Patreon, which we will link in the video description down below. And as an independent watchdog media outlet that exposes the corruption of the ruling class, we are constantly hit by algorithms and other soft censorship. So if there's any way you can help by donating or even just liking and sharing this segment, that would be immensely helpful. Now, today, the world's fifth largest country, Brazil, is at a crossroads. With elections coming up next year, the country will choose between another 4 years of far-right authoritarian Jair Bolsonaro or a return to the social democratic anti-imperialist Lula Da Silva, who is currently 15 to 20 points ahead in the polls. Or will they? Brazil is actually rife with speculation now that a military-backed coup will occur in order to stop Lula returning to power. To discuss Brazil's current predicament, I'm joined today by Brian Mier. Brian is the co-editor of Brazil Wire and the editor of the book Year of Lead, Washington, Wall Street, and the New Imperialism in Brazil. Unlike most journalists who write about the country, Brian has lived and worked in Brazil for over 25 years and speaks Portuguese. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for giving up your time. I suppose it's difficult to know where to begin with Brazil, but let's start with these enormous marches that the president, Jair Bolsonaro, organized earlier this month. They fell on Brazilian Independence Day. These were framed as being a march against the Supreme Court and the corruption thereof, with Bolsonaro himself recently stating that he would either be arrested, killed, or declared winner in next year's presidential election, which does sound quite a lot like he's going to stay in stay president or die trying mode. Some people have even depicted what went on earlier this month as a coup attempt. What do you think about that? Do you share that outlook?
Well, I view the coup as an ongoing process. As Dilma Rousseff said in a recent interview as well, it's a process that started with the impeachment in 2016, consolidated with the political imprisonment of Lula in 2018 on frivolous charges, specifically to remove him from the election and enable Jair Bolsonaro, who was losing by 20 points in the polls, to win the election. And there's been a lot of signs that he's at least trying to implement a kind of further clampdown, anti-democratic clampdown, maybe similar to what happened in 1968 with the Nixon administration supported Institutional Act 5 in Brazil, which outlawed most political parties, unions, and social movements. It looked like he was testing the waters with these September 7th protests. I went to Brasilia to cover them for Telesur, and I was just the feeling I had on the ground during those protests was that it must have been what it was like to be at a Nazi rally in the 1930s. I mean, they had put these big banners of members of the royal family from the 1800s on the sides of all of the ministry buildings on the Esplanade with quotes on them in green, in this like green color of national color of Brazil, with quotes like I'd rather die than give up my freedom and things like that. And there was fighter jets and army helicopters flying overhead, and every time it happened, the crowd, all uniformly dressed in green and yellow, would rise up and start lift their hands in the air and start screaming and stuff like they were praying or something. People were praying for bad things to happen to Lula. It was very bizarre, but they failed, And since that's happened, his popularity has just slipped even more. His disapproval rating since September 7th has grown to an all-time high. And the most shocking thing about this is that for the first time now, evangelical Christians the majority, the largest, there's more evangelical Christians who think that Bolsonaro is doing poor to very bad job than those who approve of him. And this was his key demographic of getting elected. So his approval rating is down to like 22%. And that, that just makes him dangerous. He's got 17 current or retired military generals in his cabinet, over 6,000 military officers in his government. This is more than they had during the last two presidencies during the military dictatorship. There's actually more military in government now than there were in the last 10 years of military dictatorship, basically. And so we're kind of at this crossroads where we're wondering, is there really going to be an election next year? Is there going to be more of this kind of clampdown, or have elites who are antagonistic to him managed to turn the tables? I mean, a lot of people in agribusiness, for example, depend on China, and they're sick of his anti-China xenophobia and things too. So it's really just up in the air right now.
Well, I guess if it does go to election next year, then his political opponent and his biggest test will be Lula da Silva, who was president between 2003 and 2010, the head of the Workers' Party. Could you explain who Lula is and why he's so popular there?
Yeah, Lula represents a project of national development for Brazil. So there's a lot of confusion spread in the Anglo media, which try to reduce him to this kind of like cult of personality figure who has a kind of like cult-like following or something among really the majority of the Brazilian population. The reason people like him so much is because of the project which he represented, which is sovereignty, autonomy, South-South solidarity. And, despite all of the criticism that you could make of, I lived in Brazil during his entire presidency, and I could criticize him too, but at his best, he represented, an alternative to Northern capitalist hegemony. And his role in helping formulate the BRICS was a sign of, support for creation of a multipolar world. And this irritated a lot of people. One of the things that his project stands for is like maintaining national control over natural resources, such as petroleum and all of the other commodities that are found amply in Brazil. This put him up against the international oil industry. At one point, Petrobras, the state petroleum company, was becoming the largest petroleum company in the world after the pre-salt offshore deposits were discovered. And so, since that's happened, since the coup and everything, it's become less and less important. They're outsourcing more and more. BlackRock's taken over its gas station franchise in Brazil, for example. And also he stood for, despite, all of the problems that organized labor has been having, he was the first labor union leader president, in Brazil's history, and one of the first, I think, in world history of actual union leader who's become a president of a country. And despite the fact that the unions in Brazil have lost a lot of power due to robotization and computers. I mean, one of the biggest and strongest unions historically in Brazil on the left is the bank tellers union, which has lost like 80% of its workers just because of ATM machines since the 1980s, Despite all of those losses, he still managed to put focus on using Keynesian or developmentalist economic strategies, like stimulus for internal manufacturing and consumption of Brazilian goods, such as automobiles and electrodomestic products and things like that, which had a very positive effect on the labor market, despite the fact that, the unions kept striking the entire time he was president. He was a labor union leader in power, but the CUT, Labor Union Federation, held 1,200 strikes in 2010, his last year in office, many of them against PT governments. So, and so when people say they get behind Lula, they're getting behind the project. No, a lot of people really love him as a personality, as someone who rose up from abject poverty, but never forgot that he had been poor before and still knows how to communicate to poor people in relevant ways using metaphors from, the day-to-day life. And so he's someone who still lives in kind of like the Gary, Indiana of Sao Paulo, which is this steel this factory town that's got the worst air pollution in the region called San Bernardo. So he's someone who he's viewed as someone who's never kind of like sold out from where he's come from, and who's capable of managing all of these diverse political antagonistic factions to push through a kind of center-left or Keynesian developmentalist project for the nation that emphasizes autonomy and sovereignty.
Yeah, I guess that sort of framing the man of the people is really important here, and it's actually quite common across Latin America. Lula, of course, was a shoeshine boy in his youth. He was disabled in an accident when he was a machinist. But actually, maybe if we're in the US or in Europe, the idea of a working class person becoming president seems utterly absurd. But right now in Latin America, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela was a bus driver and then a union leader. The new president of Peru, he was once selling stuff on the side of the road, and he was a toilet cleaner. So it really is possible in Latin America, at least, it seems, to build these big people's movements which actually are aware of their class position and challenge the status quo and really sort of bring about real change. And of course, in Brazil, a lot of their policies are world famous. The Bolsa Familia project, which gave direct cash incentives to the poorest families, helped out something like 50 million people in the country. And it's estimated that brought 36 million people out of poverty. And so there are just incredible things that these countries, which are really hamstrung in their actual ability to change things, can do. And it just kind of thinks, you start to think, maybe, what could we do in the West if we started learning from these guys? But yeah, of course, it wasn't the last. Lula was put in prison by the Brazilian court system, and his successor, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. Both of those charges were pretty spurious, apparently for corruption-related activities. But as I'm sure a lot of people watching this know, that the judge who was presiding over this, Sergio Moro, was actually not neutral, but was actually talking with the prosecution the whole time, advising them on how to best proceed. And then Moro would later take a position in Bolsonaro's cabinet, which just, if you want to talk about corruption in Latin America, there's just a gold standard example. Could you tell us a little bit about Operation Car Wash, as it was called in the West, and what it's meant for Brazil, and to what extent was the US involved in all of this?
All right. Well, that's like a lot of things to comment on in your talk right there, because I want to go back a little and just explain a few things first. Regarding Bolsa Familia, that's gotten a lot of credit internationally because the World Bank got behind it and tried to duplicate it in an inferior fashion in countries in Africa like Ghana, lowering the monthly payments using some econometric calculations, like what's the minimum amount of food you can give people,
Wow.
the minimum amount of money. So I think the Bolsa Familia in Ghana was like $8 a month they were trying to do at one point. However, it wasn't the biggest factor in removing 36 million people from poverty in Brazil. And it's important to explain what was, because it's counter to like neoliberal economics. I mean, we know that Milton Friedman kind of supported the idea of welfare. He called it like negative income tax or something. And the neoliberals kind of like these kinds of things. The biggest, IPEA, which is the Economic Institute, Applied Economic Institute, a research institute of Brazil. It's a governmental research institution. They did a huge longitudinal survey or study about causality of the poverty reduction during the PT years. And by far, the number one cause for poverty reduction was the minimum salary increases. Now, this was the minimum salary was $50 a month in US terms when Lula took office, $315 a month when he left office. This had by far the largest effect on reduction of poverty. The second largest effect was linking retirement payments to the minimum salary and incorporating all of these rural undocumented workers into the retirement system and his retirement reforms in 2004. The Bolsa Familia was a distant third. I just want to say that right now because if you read like New York Times or something, they'll always emphasize Bolsa Familia as this miracle project, because even though it was a positive project, definitely, there is some kind of convergence with neoliberals on the issue of welfare sometimes, welfare systems. I mean, so moving forwards. And also regarding your comment about working class leaders in Latin America, I think one of the reasons for that is because many of these countries, the majority of the population is working class. I think it's a little bit harder in the US, where the majority of the population is middle class, to get some kind of working class person to take the presidency who didn't completely sell out his or her values, and become this kind of like Margaret Thatcher type character. Okay, so sorry about the background there, but moving to Lava Jato now. Basically, okay, Dilma Rousseff was impeached for a non-impeachable budgetary infraction called fiscal peddling, which was widely practiced in all levels of government at the time. It just involved shifting budget numbers around to bury a deficit or something in a report. It didn't involve an actual removal of money or personal enrichment, was an infraction, which is why it was, according to Brazilian law, not justifiable to use as an impeachment. Nevertheless, she was exonerated from it. She didn't even do it. And furthermore, it was legalized in the Senate 2 days before she was thrown out of office. And Bolsonaro is doing it right now. All right. So in terms of the Lava Jato investigation, we have an investigation that we know was public knowledge from 2016 forward. That was a joint or trilateral investigation between the US Department of Justice, which by all evidence I've seen seems to be the organization that initiated Lava Jato, that created Lava Jato, the Swiss Federal Police, and a small local public prosecutor's office in Brazil's farthest right-wing big city, Curitiba, home to the largest Nazi demonstration ever held outside of European soil in the 1930s, which prides itself on its whiteness and has a reputation as being very conservative, right? In the charges against Lula, now we know through the hacked Telegram conversations that were released by a man named Wagner Delgatti, who's facing 300 years in jail right now for his voluntary handing over of this documentation and stuff. We now know that a group of 18 FBI agents was meeting with this Lava Jato prosecution team every 15 days for 5 years during the entire course of the investigation, guiding them on tactics. And one of the key tactics they used was new in Brazil, which was the use of coerced plea bargain testimonies. They had only been legalized by Dilma Rousseff in what I think is one of the biggest mistakes of her presidency in around 2012. And it was the first time big cases like this were relying entirely on coerced plea bargains. So basically what they did was taking a page out of the DOJ handbook, they arrested all these businessmen, threatened them with massive prison sentences and total loss of income, 100 years, 126 years, 86 years, whatever. But if you give us this testimony we want, we'll transfer you to house arrest, lower your sentence to like 8 months, and you'll get partial retention of illicit assets. And so of all of the Lava Jato charges that were levied against Lula to remove him from the elections during election season, every single one of them was based entirely on 1 or 2 coerced plea bargain testimonies by these businessmen who got millions of dollars in asset retention in exchange. And in all cases, they changed their testimony multiple times before they gave one that was acceptable enough to the prosecutors and to the judge to enable them to get out of prison. There's no material evidence ever presented against Lula. No paperwork, no documentation, no record that he'd ever even set foot in the apartment in question in Guarujá. So it was essentially, it's now been proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, and in the fact that all the charges have been overturned by the Supreme Court, these were kangaroo court procedures that were designed, for political purposes, at the beck and call of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I know you guys at Brazil Wire wrote an article that noted that the Lava Jato prosecutor called Lula's arrest a gift from the CIA, didn't you? So, I mean, I think the US has certainly got something to answer for in this whole case. One of the reasons why Lula was so popular in Latin America and in Brazil was, and so unpopular in Washington, was his role in trying to build a much more multipolar world where the US was not really any longer the hegemon. I mean, in Latin America, along with leaders like Evo Morales in Bolivia or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, he really helped lead a wave of independence-minded governments that challenged US power and began to try at least to integrate Latin American countries together in a way which had never really been seen before, certainly not since the days of the likes of Simón Bolívar 200 years ago. Could you comment a bit about the pink tide, as it's called, and Lula's role in the global stage more generally?
Well, the pink tide is what people refer to this period when it seems like there was a perfect storm of good conditions for sovereignty in Latin America, really. Because it was at the moment when, on the one hand, the Bush administration was really tied up with Middle East. So it kind of started de-emphasizing Latin America. On the other hand, the US had lost all of its moral authority to criticize governments in Latin America for human rights abuses because of all of the torture allegations going out. And at the same time, there was this kind of wave of increased collaboration and communication among groups, social movements and union groups and things like that in the Latin American left, in part because of the World Social Forum. The first World Social Forum, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Nestor and Cristina Kirchner, Jose Mujica, Lula, they were all there before they took office. And in the case, and also Daniel Ortega was there, Chavez was there, but he was already in office, but it was like a forum where before it was I think over the years it's been partially sequestered by the NGO crowd, but at the beginning, it was an area of a lot of South-South dialogue and collaboration, things like that, not just with Latin America, but with people from Africa and India and Asia and places like that as well. I think that was a factor. And what happened was, one by one, leftist presidents began getting elected all over Latin America. So to the point where at one point it was like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cuba, Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, and Chile to some extent too, with Michelle Bachelet. She's center left, but and together these countries started trying to build strengthened regional trade blocs like Mercosur, ABLA. Hugo Chavez started working to create a bank of a development bank of the Americas. There was the BRICS Bank initiative. At the same time, Brazil was getting more and more involved in BRICS. At one point, the BRICS announced that they might abandon the dollar in international transactions, and Obama called up Lula in a panic, apparently, over this. So, in general, and not to say that you could make criticism about, okay, there's a few things you could criticize as well. For example, to what point was international capital kind of supporting governments like Brazil and Argentina as a more moderate alternative to Chavism, in an attempt to isolate Chavez and convince Bolivia to align more with Brazil and things like that. There was some geopolitical jockeying going around, which I think went out the door when Chavez died. I think at some point, international capital felt like having center-left governments in South America as an alternative that they could portray as alternatives to Venezuela and Cuba serve some kind of positive, thing for capitalism. And you see that in economist coverage of Lula and Brazil in the 2000s. In some points, they're really enthusiastic. But they were more enthusiastic for the first 3 years of Lula's government when he was tied to IMF conditionality agreements before him and Kirchner paid off their debt early to the IMF, and they had to lay off 2,000 workers the next day. After that point, when they abandoned the austerity stuff, I think they started losing support in the international community as well. Sorry for that long rambling answer there.
No, really interesting. I remember very well how people in the US, academics and think tankers tried to really siphon off this good left of Lula, Michelle Bachelet in Chile, and Jose Mujica in Uruguay as this, the good left who follow the rules and, they work within the system, and the very, very bad left of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro and Daniel Ortega and Evo Morales. But that always seemed like a completely fake dichotomy, this good left, bad left, because,
because they all hung out together.
Yeah, exactly. Lula, like the first thing he did after he was elected in, I think it was 2006, he went to Venezuela and openly campaigned for Hugo Chavez, his re-election. And they were all, as you said, they were all hanging out together. They were all best friends, creating these organizations which were directly challenging the United States. Like, for instance, CELAC, which was this, I don't want to say it's modeled on the European Union, but it was this union of Latin American and Caribbean nations, all the countries of the Western Hemisphere, except the US and Canada, who were specifically barred from ever joining. And a lot of the reason why I think Obama, his administration, started having a much more moderate tone towards Cuba is, in fact, what was going on in South America, where the other countries were just saying, listen, if you don't start inviting Cuba to the OAS, starting treating them normally, we're gone. We're going to just pull away and see you guys later. And so I think Obama was actually forced into this. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not particularly optimistic that Joe Biden is going to reverse the clock on Cuba. Anywho, apart from that, Lula holds a really commanding lead in the polls just now. It seems to me that this idea about, that Bolsonaro is using, that he's either going to end up dead in prison or as president, seems much more likely to apply to Lula himself, actually. What do you think the chances are of Lula becoming president next year?
Yeah, it's a good question. And he hasn't announced that he's running yet even. He doesn't have to announce he's running till 1 month before the election, really. I mean, they have very short campaign season in Brazil. It's a vastly superior system to the United States, where politicians spend millions of dollars and years campaigning there. But in terms of his chances, if they're free and fair elections, he's going to win, obviously. The question is, there was a coup in 2016. There aren't free and fair elections. 2008 was not free and fair at all. I mean, not even taking into consideration the fact that Lula was illegally removed through an exception made by the Supreme Court, and denied his legal right to run for office from behind bars, which was guaranteed by a ruling by the UN Human Rights Committee, which was legally binding in Brazil due to a law that makes their decisions legally binding or whatever. Despite all of that, even the campaign that was set up by Fernando Haddad, Lula's last-minute replacement, who came in 1 month before the election, was sabotaged illegally by Sergio Moro, the Lava Jato judge, and he's facing felony charges for it. He leaked an edited section of another coerced plea bargain testimony, damaging Haddad's image to all of the major media channels 1 week before the election. And this testimony had been dismissed by the judiciary for being made up, invalid, completely invalid. He presented it as if it was real evidence. And this was 1 week before the election. This was something that affected, basically letting all the papers who were supporting Bolsonaro, who wanted anybody except the PT, who were terrified that someone would come back in power and undo the neoliberal labor reforms and the austerity freezes and all of that. They all supported Bolsonaro. So they took this story and ran with it, except that, it's a felony to do this during the month before an election, to leak any kind of information to the media. And also, it's a felony in Brazil to accept a cabinet position from a candidate who you helped through this kind of behavior. So Moros basically got 2 felony charges against him just for sabotaging Fernando Haddad's campaign, let alone the 5 charges he has related to Lula. So even without Lula in the election, it was still sabotaged. Not even to mention all of these laws were broken related to spreading disinformation on the internet through social media with bots and things like that. Brazil doesn't have the same kind of speech freedoms that the United States does. The system is more related to the German system. So like we know now that with support from Steve Bannon, Bolsonaro's son, Carlos, micro-targeted groups of evangelical women and evangelical Christians and things like that, with misinformation that Fernando Haddad, if he were elected president, would create a government panel to decide children's gender when they reach the age of 5, and all other kinds of outrageous homophobic lies, during the days before the election. So the question is, what's going to happen next year? We already know Steve Bannon's announced that Lula is the biggest, he's the most dangerous leftist politician in the world. Brazil's elections are the second most important in the world after the US. Beatrix von Storch from AfD Germany was down meeting with Bolsonaro and his sons and fascist bloggers last month, talking about forming a new conservative international with Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's son Eduardo was on stage with Mike Lindell in Sioux Falls last month, the My Pillow guy. So we know that this battle coming up, it's not just an internal Brazil election, it's a battle against the international far right, which is putting all of its energy into the next year's election. And they're going to try and come up with all kinds of crazy things. And I don't rule out possible assassination attempt against Lula. It's too late to really come up with any legal maneuver to put him in prison at this point. So, the Biden administration is supporting Bolsonaro too. So it's not even the international far right, it's the US in general. It's both sides at this point. All of the promise of progressive Democrats influencing Biden on Latin America has gone under the bridge. He's turning out to be the worst president for Latin America since the 1980s at this point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point about how Brazil is really part of this nexus of far-right authoritarians. We've seen Brazil team up with the Trump administration, of course. Bolsonaro is a big fan of Donald Trump, always lets his supporters know that. He's quite close with Narendra Modi as well in India. And, to a certain extent, I almost agree with Steve Bannon when he says Lula is the most dangerous threat to them. When you start thinking about it in this kind of like sort of radical way that they do, where they think democracy and people having a say over their own lives is a real threat, because Brazil is a very important country. It's the 5th largest country by population. It's the largest one in Latin America, and Brazil had this ability to shield other radical governments in Latin America from the wrath of the US. So it is big enough to at least in part stand up to the world's only superpower in some points. So yeah, there is some truth to the idea that this is the second most important election coming up. If Lula does become president, what sort of policies do you think we can expect from him? Will he be more radical, or will he be more of a conciliator? I mean, and also, what do you think the Brazilian elite would prefer? Do you think they prefer the more erratic neoliberalism of Bolsonaro, or the more predictable social democracy that Lula probably will put in place?
Well, I think some elites would support Lula, but most elites would rather have, most elites would like to have a kind of neoliberal character who is polite and cordial and dresses well and says nice things, but keeps screwing over the workers as much as possible, like a João Doria or something. But when push comes to shove, I think a lot of them would still support Bolsonaro over Lula, unfortunately. In terms of what kind of government we would come to expect, I mean, I've been involved in so many arguments online, barroom arguments, this and that, about who's farther left, how far left was Lula, this and that. I think you have to look at it's not valid to compare things that someone actually did with things that other people are just talking about. You could compare Sanders to Lula, right? What would Sanders have really accomplished if he'd been elected? When Lula was in power, the most he ever had in terms of seats in parliament was 24%. 24%. With the inner ring allies of the PCdoB, the Communist Party of Brazil, and the PSOL, Socialism and Liberty Party, maybe 28% or 30% of Congress. He was only able to govern through coalition with right-wing parties. Even so, and he sacrificed a lot of the historic goals of the PT, like agrarian reform and urban reform and political reform, in the name of like eradicating hunger, which he succeeded in. But he made a lot of compromises. For example, legalizing genetically modified agricultural products and things like that. That was that pissed off everyone in the environmental movement when it happened. So I think a new government of his would have to rely on a similar coalition. He would have to govern by decree, mostly, which is what he did last time. Most of the things that eradicated, that really caused positive change in Brazil were initially just done through decrees because it was unable to pass them in parliament. Like turning over, like building 17 new free public universities and guaranteeing 50% vacancies for people from the working class with a small differential for Afro-Brazilians. The PT, starting in Lula administration and Dilma, they pushed that through initially just through decrees. So I think he would take over in an environment where he would be suffering a lot of attacks from this core 20% of the Brazilian population that's fascist. Although they've never gone away, they were around when he was around the first time. So he's got experience doing it, but I don't think he would be able to govern as radically as he would want to, just as he wasn't able to the last time around. But he's practical and pragmatic enough that I think he would be able to undo most, if not all, of the labor reforms and partially renationalize, the assets lost by Petrobras since the coup. I'm not sure if he could do it all. I don't think he could undo all of the privatizations at this point. He would probably be forced to do some kinds of compromises. He would start raising the minimum wage again. I mean, he's got his, his project for governance emphasizes all of these key points. So that's what I think would happen. But he would need, the thing is, he always banked on this kind of petite bourgeois nationalist elite class, business class, that was decimated by the Lava Jato investigation. That's the sector of Brazil's economy that Lava Jato went after. These nationalist business, like the Tatas in India or something. You had these big companies like Odebrecht, where the owners actually cared about development in Brazil. And so they've been kind of all bankrupted by Judge Moro. And in their place, we have Halliburton and companies like that coming in, and that class has been decimated. I don't know how he could rebuild it really at this point. Remembering that his vice president was one of these people. He was a clothing factory owner who just happened to be he was a center-right Keynesian who was very nationalist. But you know what? He was in his 70s at that time. That generation is kind of almost gone now. So it'll be interesting to see, first of all, if he's elected, which I hope, and then secondly, how he could govern if he is elected. But this idea that he would be incapable of governing, which is being spread by some people, self-declared vanguard leftists, in the Anglo media and things like that, is a bunch of BS, because he was suffering the same adversaries the last time around, and he managed okay.
And if Lula is elected, that will obviously open the door for a lot of other countries in the region. I think they certainly need support, countries like Venezuela or Nicaragua. If Lula is elected, Does that bode well for the prospects of a new anti-imperialist force or alliance or an independence-minded movement in Latin America, do you think?
Well, it bodes well for multipolarity. It would bode well for, more even-handed, non-aligned relationships between China and the US, I think. I mean, what the US is trying to do is build this coalition of all sycophantic, entreguista leaders who favor the US over its largest trade partner, because now China is the biggest trade partner for almost every country in Latin America. It doesn't make any rational sense for any leader to favor the US over China right now. The rational thing to do would be either to favor China or to try not to take sides, like the non-aligned movement in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, right? That's the thing that makes sense. But Biden's trying to build this kind of, the only way you could even get a bunch of leaders on your side in that kind of project is to buy them, or to put them in power or something, because it doesn't make any sense. So I think I don't want to sound overly optimistic about this, but I know that if Lula was put into power, it would be it would give a lot of power to these other left governments that are under attack from the US right now. He's said some depressing things about Nicaragua lately, but I think it was meant as advice. I think he's trying to suggest to Ortega to pull a Cristina Kirchner move in the upcoming election and run as vice or something. I think that's what he meant when he said this stuff about Nicaragua. But the history of the Workers' Party with relations with the Sandinistas is really strong. Relations were good during Lula and Dilma, and definitely Cuba, Venezuela, and all these other countries would have a shot in the arm from having such a big country in their neighborhood that recognizes them and engages in them with trade and all these other things.
Yeah, if nothing else, Brazil being a massive food exporter could certainly help those countries with their problems. I know also Lula was very important in trying to build a more multipolar world. I watched an interview with you a couple of years ago where you talked to Lula, and he said that he actually went to Iran to negotiate pretty much the Obama administration's nuclear deal. He got Ahmadinejad to sign it, and then when he went back to the West, everybody treated him like a pariah. Like, what are you doing? Don't get involved. They didn't like this guy from the global South coming in and trying to, be an independent-minded leader, which is what most of the world want to see.
Yep, that really pissed a lot of people off. I think it really pissed people in the UK off when Brazil passed up the UK and became the 5th largest economy in the world. When Lula and Dilma were president, I think that sent a warning sign to the British, and we now know they were involved in, obviously in the coup and all this process as well, and also holding secret meetings with Bolsonaro before he was elected and things like that. But I think that definitely the real issue. Fidel Castro used to say that. Why is the U.S. why is it so intent on destroying Cuba? Because it's such a small country. It's economically, it's not important at all. And Castro always said it was because of hegemony. It's a thorn in the side of the U.S. to have a country 90 miles away that has a different economic system, a different vision of concepts like solidarity and education, things like that. And I think that this issue of hegemony, of the fact that Brazil at least was trying to present a kind of partially independent economic and political project, partially contra-hegemonic, irritated a lot of people in Europe and the United States. Even if it wasn't like this massive socialist revolution or something like that, there were elements of it that just really were unacceptable to the United States. Like, for example, earmarking 100% of the profits from the state petroleum company, which you refuse to privatize, to public health and education. That pisses people off. That there would even be this example, like why it doesn't even help the U.S. doesn't want to hear that another big country in the Americas has a public health system and free public university and things like that either.
Yeah, I mean, the Brazilian health system, even though they don't have the money that the US does, is actually pretty impressive, all things considered. Certainly, I think a lot of Americans would be surprised to see what sort of services you can get for free in Brazil. Can we talk about Bolsonaro a little bit more? He's got a lot of generally Brazil is treated as this, very positively in the US because it's pretty much because it's a client state of the US right now, with Bolsonaro doing what he's told whenever Washington asks of him. But he was just so poorly mismanaged the COVID response, that I think just the sort of chaos that led to him getting a lot of bad press in the US. But it was nothing compared to what you guys were writing. At Brazil Wire, you wrote that Brazil is at the mercy of a deranged lunatic. Can you explain why you wrote that, and just generally talk a bit more about Brazil and Bolsonaro and COVID?
Well, I think I wrote something for Fair about this. I think the Anglo media used Bolsonaro as a scapegoat for his COVID response, to be able to say, look over there, it's even worse. When actually what he did was he just copied Trump and Boris Johnson. And that's all his COVID response was, Trump, right? So it's kind of hypocritical for the US media to point out. I mean, he didn't invent a shitty way to respond to the COVID crisis. He just copied all of Trump's talking points,
Yeah,
and even so, it's not
hydroxychloroquine and everything, right?
Yeah, everything. Trump sent him 2 million doses of hydroxychloroquine when the FDA banned it for treating COVID. And the funny thing is, despite all of this, Brazil's still done a better job than the US. Even now, there's less anti-vaxxers in Brazil. There's some, I mean, they're copying the US now, but there isn't this big movement of, 30% of the population of Brazil that's refusing to take the vaccine or something. They haven't taken it yet because it hasn't been made available to them yet, even though over 70%'s taken the first shot. Okay. But he's, I don't know if, I might have called him a deranged lunatic at a moment of anger, but I think a lot of what he does is really kind of calculated. He's just literally, he's literally someone with strong Nazi sympathies who uses Nazi elements, remembering that, a lot of Nazis came over to Brazil after World War II, and former Nazis were giving consulting to the Brazilian dictatorship on torture and things like that. And there was an indigenous fascist movement called the Integralists that are still around today, where Beatriz von Storch met in their headquarters with members of the Brazilian royal family who were far right, ultra-right Catholics as well. So there's always been all of these fascist elements in Brazil bubbling under the surface. The military dictatorship was neo-fascist, using a lot of the trappings of fascism. And so Bolsonaro, is someone who has said publicly that he would have proudly fought in Hitler's army in World War II. He wrote letters to neo-Nazi websites 15 years ago saying, "You're the reason my political career exists." He had a campaign slogan, basically it was Brazil über alles, Brazil above all. He had another campaign slogan that said, "Work sets you free." And he had one of his ministers was forced to resign because he simulated a Goebbels press conference from Nazi Germany with the same, the picture of Bolsonaro positioned in the same place the Hitler photo was. And so I would say that it's not insane or deranged, his position. It's just fascist, it's fascist. He's built up internal enemies. He foams at the mouth and rants and raves against imaginary communist enemies, that he creates. So the Economist magazine is now called the Ecommunist to him, Wow. Even the Economist is communist. So everybody's communist. In that sense, it's very similar to, the rantings of a Hitler type against communists. He uses a lot of this anti-communist rhetoric from the Nazis. Communists eat children or whatever, this kind of garbage. So I would say deranged in the sense that like Mussolini and Hitler were deranged, but there's a logic behind it. There's a rational, there's an ethos. He has this kind of fascist ethos, and you could really see it out in full swing on September 7th in Brasilia. It reminded me of what, I was filming for Telesur, right? So I started filming, and all of a sudden I realized that my camera angles were beginning to look like Leni Riefenstahl camera angles. That's how fascist the scene was. Like I couldn't help, like all of a sudden getting these majestic looking camera angles and stuff with these jets flying overhead. It was really crazy. So
I think that's a really good point. Sometimes Bolsonaro is a lot more intelligent and thoughtful than we give him credit for. Certainly when he voted to impeach Dilma and then dedicated his vote to the unit that was brutalizing Dilma when she was a rebel during the dictatorship. He knew exactly what he was doing there, didn't he?
Yeah, the rape unit. these were rapists, right? And you still had people trying to say that Bolsonaro wasn't fascist when he took office. Like, the left is being alarmist for suggesting they might be fascist. He dedicated his vote to impeach Dilma Rousseff to a man, Colonel Brilliante Ustra, who used to have rats stuck up women's vaginas, right? So he's not a fascist? Give me a break. Not that that's a symbol. There's a lot of reasons that you could call him a fascist, but that's like an example, like openly supporting torture of communists and labor union activists.
Sure. Yeah, I think in the West, we tend to think about fascism as just the camps of Hitler. And maybe if you're a real intellectual, you might be able to talk about Mussolini. But in Latin America, there's a much longer strain of fascism, which has gone back decades, with many flavors in many countries which have had military or semi-military dictatorships ruling over these countries for decades in some cases. I want to just, as we finish, I want to go on to a bit more of a more positive light. It's 100 years to the month since Paulo Freire was born, the legendary Brazilian educator. I would urge everybody to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I think it's a marvelous tome. I think a lot of us have had teachers in our life who've been so good that they've really inspired us and changed our views on things, but not many people have had a teacher so good that the government sent them to jail. And that's really how good Paulo Freire was, His book has been translated into dozens of languages, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I know you guys at Brazil Wire are big fans of him. Do you want to say anything about Paulo Freire?
Yeah, he's kind of like, on the one side, he's been attacked by the Bolsonaro administration now. He's been considered like the biggest enemy to Brazilian education for years, 3-4 years now. Tried to purge any reference of him from the educational system. On the other side, you have the bourgeois trying to convert him into this harmless Martin Luther King style icon, robbing all of the revolutionary messages from his teaching, as epitomized by the Google doodle yesterday of Paulo Freire on his 100th birthday. But I think in addition to like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a really important book, one thing that stands out about him is all of the really incredible solidarity work he did while he was in exile. He was in Guinea-Bissau with Amilcar Cabral. He was an important figure in the anti-apartheid movement. He helped the Sandinistas develop their adult literacy program. He was organizing with the Puerto Rican separatists in my hometown of Chicago in the 1970s. I found out when I was back there. He helped start an alternative school in 1973 in the Puerto Rican neighborhood of Humboldt Park. And he was someone who believed a lot in solidarity. And I guess I could just say like a technique I learned about, because I used to work in a favela in Sao Paulo with a bunch of people who actually worked with Paulo Freire and learned everything. They're like community organizers, learned everything from him firsthand. And one of the techniques he taught them is when you go into a room full of people who don't have any education, which was very common in the military dictatorship. Only 60% of the people in Brazil had access to schools. So they told me of a story in a Catholic church where Paulo Freire walked in and said, well, what do you guys know? And someone was like, well, I don't know anything. I don't know how to read. I don't know anything. And Freire was like, well, what do you know? Like, what do you know how to do? How do you eat? Where are you from? Well, I'm from this little town in Bahia. Well, how did you used to eat when you lived? I was a fisherman. How do you know when it's time to catch fish? Well, because the sun, it's like the sun is at a certain angle over the water in the morning, at dawn. And so he'd start writing down on the wall everything that the people told me they knew about from their own life. And by the end of the exercise, he'd covered all 4 walls. And so then he's like, well, how can you tell me you don't know anything then? It's obvious that you know all kinds of things. What you guys don't know how to do is read, and that would be like a starting point of a kind of exercise he would do back in the day. So he was a really incredible teacher. And my favorite quote of his is that it would be naive to expect a class of oppressors to ever give the oppressed the knowledge they would need to understand, the nature of their subjugation, right? So, and also if you've ever had the teachers told you to like, let's all pull our chairs together in a circle, that's basically Paulo Freire too.
Yeah, it's incredible how much influence Freire's had around the world, and a lot of people don't realize it. I mean, that book, which is really a teaching manual, is really about trying to get people who are like more activist or revolutionary minded to really think about the sort of biases that are inculcated into them. There's a great quote about how, there's a certain section of the oppressed or a class which will always side with the people who are being oppressed, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation, and they have to really they take with them the sort of biases and the snobbishness of it, and think that these ordinary people can't lead themselves, when in fact they're more than capable of doing so. And in fact, the only way to build a really truly just society is to have those people leading from the start. Yeah, Brian Mier from Brazil.
Oh, sorry.
No, keep going.
That's exactly what Lula represents. I mean, remembering that Paulo Freire helped Lula found the Workers' Party too.
Sure. Yeah, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure, Brian Mier of Brazil Wire. I want everyone watching this to go to brazilwire.com. That's Brazil with an S. Have a look at the website and then bookmark it. Is there anything else you want to talk about or discuss or plug today, Brian?
No, that's about it, except that I'm also, in addition to editing Brazil Wire, I'm a Brazil correspondent for Telesur English news program from the South. So you can find me on Twitter with my Telesur account, Brian M. Telesur.
Brian M. Telesur, we'll put that up on the screen. Thank you very much for your time today, Brian. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.